many people here have done some web development with Python, or web development in general? So, how many of you made like a REST API or know what a REST API is? Okay, so majority of you. So you use like SQL Alchemy and Flask and all that, most of you? Or what are some of the frameworks that you used? Django? Flask? So, okay. So for this talk, basically the goal of this is to explain what GraphQL is. How many of you have heard of GraphQL? Okay, so decent amount of you. How many have used it before, like made an application using GraphQL? Nobody. Okay, so this will be a great talk for you. So my purpose for this is to basically explain what GraphQL is, why you would even use it, like what's the point, like why this new technology, and then spin up a Flask application using a SQL Alchemy backend, and basically determine or show like how you would actually use GraphQL, and maybe like from there we can see what are the benefits over a REST API. So, any questions so far? The outline, yeah. So, explain what and why of GraphQL, tools and terminology of the GraphQL ecosystem. Can you guys all see this, or does it need to be a little bigger? Good. Provide some intuition on like how GraphQL actually like works under the hood. It's just like one of the big things that I struggled with going into GraphQL. If you guys have like Googled around and like seen what it is, it's like, how does this work? Like, what is this even doing? And that was the biggest hurdle for me. And once that clicked, I was like, oh wow, this is really powerful. And then demo a Flask application using GraphQL to start data using a SQL database and SQL Alchemy. I don't know. It's supposed to be ORM. There's a typo, sorry. So SQL Alchemy, and then maybe from there go into some client-side libraries. So GraphQL was kind of, well, I'll get that into the next slide, and then just go over the feature of GraphQL. So what is it? So GraphQL it's a query language for your APIs. So without thinking of any backend stuff or whatever, we'll get into it. So it's basically, I want some data from the server, and I'm like a web client, so I'm in JavaScript, and I want to show the user some data. Usually you would use like a REST API, right? And you would say, give me the users, and then it would just give you data back. You have no control as the client of what you get back. It just gives you the data back, right? Sorry. The OE flashlight always gets you. So here is what a GraphQL query looks like. So as the client, there's this little syntax here. It's like, I want the user with ID, whatever that is, and then I want his name, his viewer friend, I don't know what that is, his profile picture, his friend connection, how many friends he has, and then the ID and name of those friends. So instead of like as a REST API, you might have to be like, oh, I'll make a call for this user. Oh, I'm going to make a call to get this user's friends. Oh, I'm going to make a call to get this user's profile picture. With the GraphQL, it's just one call. So this, as you can tell from this example, it was invented by Facebook. It was open source around the same time as React. And like a big misconception is like, oh, GraphQL and React, they go together. But GraphQL can actually be used completely independent of React. So if you don't use React and you have no interest in using React, then GraphQL can still be used for you. Like at work, we still use it for like communication from like backend to backend, and it still works really well for there. So it's pretty flexible, and there's all kinds of ways to use it with different client libraries as well. Any questions so far? So yes, so GraphQL, this is kind of the why. So GraphQL is meant to replace your REST API. So it's meant to be like as a client that maybe is authenticated or not authenticated, that instead that I want to query some language and interface with an API, this is what GraphQL is meant for versus like REST. So basically the pros are, it's as we can see, it's got a type system. So what this type system allows us to do is it allows us to get some introspection about the API. And there's a killer app that I'll show you. It's basically the GraphQL, graphical. And so basically what it does is like, instead of as a REST API, you have to like, oh, there's some documentation and it may or may not be up to date. Like when you're writing a REST API, you have to like write the documentation or maybe do like the options request, or not the options request, but whatever it is to like get the data about it. Not many people implement that. So it's not very self-documenting, REST APIs aren't. So like, have any of you guys like ever went to the client and like, I want to make this request to the server, but I don't know what it takes, and I don't know what data I'm going to get back. I'm just going to try it and see what happens. You guys had that problem? Yeah. So GraphQL, its biggest strength is solving that problem. The second problem is the client determines what data to fetch. So if you're on like a mobile device or a slow network connection, and instead of like, oh, as a server, they give you a limited number of endpoints, and you're like, oh, I want to get this guy's friends, and I want to get this user ID, and I want to get his profile picture. Like there might be different endpoints for that, and you might have to make different requests. With GraphQL, you can make one request, and you get all that data back, which is, in my opinion, really powerful, and it's really performant if you design your backend well. Another thing is reusability. So like when you make a REST endpoint, like say you make users and you make that REST endpoint, when you go to make your next endpoint, how often do you get to reuse like any of your code that you used to that last endpoint? Maybe a little bit if you're using like some sort of like Marshmallow for Flask or Django Forms or Django REST framework. Maybe a little bit, but it's like the new endpoint is just like you're completely starting over. In GraphQL, you only have one endpoint that you hit, and that's it. And so, well, the last point is more efficient data fetching. So before we get into it, we'll go over some cons as well. So one of the biggest cons is like it's a language. It's another language that you're using to query with, and that does add some overhead. So it's like REST API is just like HTTP. Like there's no overhead there. It just knows how to communicate the client and the server. We've been doing that for a while, 10 years, and servers are really good at that. So this does add some overhead. And it's not much, but it definitely is there. And there's definitely some setup overhead. I think this will get solved more and more over time after like these frameworks mature. Like web frameworks and like back in like 2005, they weren't as easy to set up as like now. Like now you just open up a new project, you make your route, and you just start typing away, and you can make a REST API pretty easily. And another con is REST is obviously more ubiquitous. It's like, it's the standard in industry right now. It's like, if I want to go get interface with some company and get like interact with their API like Stripe, I'm going to use the REST API. I'm not going to use SOAP or GraphQL or something like that one. Like I'm probably going to use the REST API. So that is one thing. If you're, looking to interface with like some third-party clients, you might not want to consider GraphQL because they might be like, "What in the world is this?" So, okay. So I'll probably dive into the code before we get back into this, so we can get some more intuition for this later. But this is basically showing how a GraphQL query gets resolved. So for the majority of this, I want to kind of be risky here and show some live code here. So we'll start out here. So the root of a GraphQL application is, how many people does this look familiar with? Like a Flask, basic Flask application here. Most people look pretty familiar. So just for those of you who aren't familiar, basically I have a database. I'm setting up my database, setting up migrations, which isn't necessary. This is all stuff independent of GraphQL. So for GraphQL here, I have this one, so I import Flask GraphQL, and it gives me this route. And then I have graphene, and then I have a schema, which we'll look at later. And basically, that gives me a route at /GraphQL that I can hit, and then I pass in my schema, which we'll see in a minute. And then it gives me this nice graphical that I can use for debugging. So let's go look at graphical, because I think this is the best part about GraphQL, and it's the best part to just get around and learn. So first off, so basically what this is this here's a playground. So here's where I can define my queries, and here's the data that my server is going to return. So if I just erase this, so I can just start typing here, and I go, oh, I can get authors, or I can get books, and I can query, okay, I want books. So what can we do here? Oh, I can get an ID, I can get an ISBN, and I can get a title. And then I can get author. Oh, I wanted the author, and I want the ID, the first name, and the last name. And then, oh, I also want readers, and I want their ID, first name, and last name. So this data model here is kind of like, this is very artificial and just made up simple data model, but it illustrates some key concepts. So for like SQL database, most of you use SQL database. So you can see here that you can see some tables like, oh, we have books, and then they're related to an author, and then they're related to readers. So with GraphQL, like you could just, with a simple query, instead of like a REST API, it's like, oh, I want to get the author. Oh, I want to get the books. Oh, I want to get the readers. So with this one simple query, you get all of that data. So here you can see it returns. So here it will return, like this is the convention, it will return data, and then under data, it will return whatever your root query is here. So for example, here I did books, but if I want to do authors, and I just want the ID of the authors, it will return authors. So there, it might seem like magical, like how do I know this stuff? Like, yeah, it gives me some auto-completion, but still doesn't seem very user-friendly, right? So the key killer app here is the documentation. So this, I did no extra work. This is all given to me out of the box. So I just set up with my GraphQL framework on the server side, and it automatically generates this. Like, so for like REST APIs, like there's some stuff that will generate documentation for you, but it's usually not that good. But this, due to the type system of GraphQL, it just automatically works. So here you can see, oh, go ahead.
So that's all part of that Flask GraphQL library, or?
Yeah, so Flask GraphQL is a wrapper around Graphene. So I probably should have mentioned that. Sorry, I skipped over that. So Graphene, let's just go to the website here. So Graphene Python. So Graphene Python is a framework for using GraphQL in Python. So it gives you high-level tools and primitives to make all this stuff very seamless and easy. So we'll dive into that. I just want to get some intuition before we go on. So here you can see you have books, what books return. Oh, I can get readers, what readers return, and then books, and then it just goes all the way down. So any questions?
What's your data source?
SQL database. I will show you that. So, yes.
So is your schema referring to your model?
So you define in your code these types, these GraphQL types, and your schema is reflective of your types. So it will probably make more sense once we get into the code. So here I have this file called schema.py, and this is the schema that we passed in to the route. And don't worry about not too much about the mutation yet. I'll explain that later. But queries here, so you have a query type, which basically defines, so here I have books, and that is a graphene list of a book type. And so authors, and then that is a graphene list of the author type. So where in here, where you saw that I have this documentation in here, the books and the authors, that is where this is defined. These books and authors return or map to what this is. So the key concept of a backend of GraphQL is a resolver. And the way you can think about a resolver is almost like a controller for your REST API. Kind of. It's a little different. So basically what happens is when you're calling authors and you're going in to resolve the author. So when I issue this query right here, this is what gets called the resolve authors. And then that uses the SQL alchemy to go and fetch my data. And then basically what's returned from my query is what's returned back to the author. So instead of querying the SQL alchemy database here, so I can just comment this line out. Comment that. And I can just return an author type, and it has an ID of 1, and then first name equals test, and so actually it has to be an array since it's a list. So I can return a list, and then object type, and snake case. So that's one thing that this framework does for you, is it will take your snake case Python code that we all know and love, and it'll put it back to the camel case that the rest of the world for some reason uses. So here is the ID 1, first name, test. So you can have any data source you want, but I say SQL database is probably the most standard. I mean, if you go and read online, like a lot of the Node people use MongoDB with GraphQL, but for Python, most people use SQL databases. So that's how you return the data. So let's go ahead and look at what exactly is this author type. So this is the core component of a backend of GraphQL, is the types. So it's almost like in a strongly typed language. Should anybody use C# or any strongly typed languages here? Yeah. It's almost like your types in that language, but it's defined for GraphQL. So graphene here gives us this object type. So we want to define an object for graphene. And that's basically telling this is a GraphQL object. And I want an ID, which is an integer. And I want a first name, which is a string, and last name. But then I want books, which is a type of another GraphQL type of books. And so then that will map over to this type. And so you have to, for every type that you have that refers to another type, you have to have a resolver for that. Is there any questions about this?
So you're basically defining all of the portions of your model.
Yes.
For graphene and adding them to a list.
Yes. So here I have my author model in SQL. So here's my table name is authors. Here's my columns, and so I have my book and my reader. So I have my models, but then I also have my graphene types. So basically, it's mapping what's in my database model to what's going to be in my GraphQL model.
Really cool.
Yes, this gets cooler. Hold on. So that seems like a lot of unnecessary typing. I already defined it in my database. Why in the heck do I need to go define it again in my GraphQL? Like, that seems way too much typing. That's not very Pythonic.
You said everyone has to have a resolver. Does it just look for resolve in the function?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's like, it's a little bit magical, but it's like, okay, I have books. So when I want to resolve books, it's resolve underscore, and then whatever the name of my related. So I could change this to book Z, and then we go here and reload. I have to uncomment my query to, I already did. So it's like books Z ID. It's null because my resolver here is books, so it's not mapping up. So when I change it back to book Z, it's a bug. Object has no attribute books.
Books.
No, that's the self. We'll get into what's passed in the resolver. So the self is my SQL model. So it's the actual instance of my SQL alchemy model, not the graphene object type. So it knows to pass in. Let me try to refresh. I'm not sure why. But when we change it back to books, it knows to call. Oh no! What did I break?
Danger of live coding.
Yeah, the dreaded live coding. Oh, I don't think I saved that. Yeah, that's what it was. I didn't say that was still. So if I go to books, Z, and then books, Z. There we go. So I think now it's like kind of mysterious how these resolvers work. Wouldn't you guys think? So the resolver, so the root resolver, so self here is actually null. So there's nothing in self at the root resolver. So for a query type, when you're at the root, there's nothing going to be passed in because it's like a tree. So as you pass stuff down into it, it will pass in so whatever is returned from the resolver above gets passed down the tree in the self argument. So here, this is the top of the tree, the resolve, so nothing is getting passed into self, which is a little bit confusing when you first start, but as sort of as you get used to it, it kind of makes more sense. I'm still kind of confused about it, but I don't know. It's just, so I just accepted it. So the arguments here, is if I want to pass in certain arguments, so let's say, this is risky. So if I want to do argument is ID, actually, I'm not sure of the syntax. But I probably should have had an example of this. But arguments are basically, if you want to, going back to earlier where it passed in the ID, so that's where you can define this will take in a ID or whatever. It's a dictionary, and the keys of that dictionary are the arguments that you want to pass in to your resolver. And then the context is the Flask request object, or if you're using Django, it'll be the Django request object. And then info is, that is the most confusing part. I just have stayed away. I have not even used it, but it's basically the metadata about GraphQL, what fields does this person request, and what was the query and what was the query called, and all kinds of metadata there. And some people use that to they only want to fetch certain fields or do other crazy stuff, but I've just staying away. And I've had good success so far, but maybe I should look into that more. So any questions about how this resolver works? Any questions? Anybody lost? Any overall questions, or everybody good? You can ask, don't be afraid. Listen.
Do your types have to be hierarchical, entirely? Can you have, two root types on endpoints?
Yeah, you can. So if I want to do authors and books, I can request them side by side. Yes.
Okay.
So it's basically running both of those resolvers side by side. So if you have a bunch of different queries, you could run whatever you wanted in one request, and it will resolve it all. Any other questions?
Is one request, one query?
Yeah, it's one HTTP request. So we can open the network tab here. Oops. So the network tab here. Can everybody see? Well, I can't even see it. So everybody see that? So here, this is really small. Sorry. But here you can see the query that's passed over. So, sorry, I lost it. So you see authors and books. So both queries are passed over. And then the response has all of this data that you're seeing over here. So it's all one mega endpoint. Any other questions? So I think it would be useful to take a step back here and go to this graph. And it's kind of, go back. this kind of will explain what we just saw. So so this is my books, and like I said, you can pass in an argument for an ID. And so what happens here is you're at the root of your tree. So at the root of your tree, you have the query type of what we saw. And then under there, we have an author. And so the author had the name, and then he has posts, right? So it hit a scalar, as they call it in GraphQL. So that's like a string, an integer, or like the fundamental types, like a Boolean. And so when it hits that, it knows, oh, I don't want to go any farther. This needs to be returned to the endpoint. But if it hits another GraphQL, like higher order type, or whatever they call them, object type, it will know, okay, I need to resolve this. So where you saw the author had the books, and then it needed the resolve books method, it said, that was basically saying, okay, this is not a root or a scalar type, so it needs to be resolved. So then when that resolves, it will hit the title, and so, okay, that's a string, terminate there. Oh, that's a title, terminate there. But then it hit authors again, and then you have to go back and resolve those again. So basically, it's a tree down until you resolve to all scalar types. Any questions about that?
So does it resolves that foreign key for each one?
Resolves the foreign key for each one. Yes, but it's not a database, so it doesn't say it's a foreign key.
Right.
But since we're using a SQL database, we model our GraphQL relationships like we see in our SQL database, because they do map over very well. Because it's like a graph relationship between your tables. So yes, it would say it's effectively resolving the foreign key. Any other questions? So this part so far is what you can find on, like if you go on Google and GraphQL, this stuff is, it's pretty easy to find. So, but what I found is once you get this part, since GraphQL is pretty new, after you get past this part, it's like, oh, there's a lot of information falling off. It's like you have to start digging into source code and all kinds of stuff like this. So one thing that I found with GraphQL is it can be very inefficient. So if any of you are SQL DBAs out here, you're like, what kind of SQL is this thing generating? Like, this gotta be the most inefficient thing in the world. This is tearing up my SQL database. My DBA is gonna kill me. So that is where these join loads come in. And I'm just gonna take these out real fast, and so we can all cry a little bit for a second. So here I have my Flask console, and I have no requests. So I'm gonna go over here and hit my endpoint. Let's get more data. Let's get the readers. Let's get their ID and their name. And let's get the first name. And we'll remove books because that's kind of confusing for this. So I got all this data. It's not a ton of data. So let's look at the SQL. Okay. So let's find where the server restarted. Oh, this was not actually as bad as I thought it was going to be. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, a lot of select statements. That is obviously not very efficient just to get that data, right? So that is where I found you have to be the most careful when using GraphQL, is you need to really profile like what queries are being sent to your database and do your joins. SQL Alchemy is actually really, really good for this versus like I've tried to do this in Node, and the ORMs in Node, they provide like no primitives for doing the join. So I've seen like where I've done 500 queries to the database with just one request, and it's obviously not very good. You're not going to get very far with that. So when we add our SQL Alchemy loads, so is anybody familiar with the SQL Alchemy syntax? So what that is basically saying is I have these authors, And related to the authors, I have books, and related to books, I have readers. So it's saying, do a join. This people like SQL join. So do a join on books and do a join to books readers. So instead of doing all those different queries to get all the different data for the related tables, it will join it all together for you. So now we'll restart the server and we'll do a GraphQL request and boom, one big query. So that is one of the biggest things that I found that not many people talk about online is like, you really have to be careful about slamming your database because I've gotten myself in a lot of trouble. It's like, oh, this endpoint is taking 40 seconds to return, something's going on. This is obviously not very good. And then just adding some joins in, it will be like under a second. So that's one thing to be careful with. The next thing is, and this is probably the biggest question that I've seen that I had starting out was, okay, that's all cool, but I want to actually change some data on the server. Like I query, but that's not very useful. I mean, it's sort of useful, but it's like I've got to change some data on the server. And when you go online and you look, there is not very much information about that. Some people are like, oh, just use the GraphQL queries and use REST for your data changes, but I think that's a bad move because mutations are, in their own way, just as powerful as queries. So it's a very similar concept as a query. So you have like GraphQL is all about the types. So instead of a query type here, we now have a mutation type. Right? Any questions or? And so on a mutation, we have a book, and then we have our reader again. And so instead of a SQL type, or instead of a object type, we have what we call an input type. So on our input type, we have a first name and last name. So let's go ahead and see this in action. So we can go here. And so with all mutations, you have to prefix it with mutation. Let's get rid of this brace. And then, so as you can see, the braces syntax now defines like at your hierarchy of your types. So we have create author. So I'm going to create an author. So let's do Derby, and then last name, Pi. And so a mutation is you have these input types, and you can actually see it right here in this documentation. So create author is, it's almost like a function call, but it's like, okay, create author has this data, or you pass in first name and last name, and then it returns an author mutation. And so what that is so once you have a mutation, you pass it mutate data, and then it returns you a query that you can get the related data on that. So you can query after you change data with mutation. And that's what I think is the really powerful part of GraphQL. So it's like, say you want to change something really nested down, but you want to reload your view after you've changed some like really nested data. So you could have like create author, and then you could have it return like books, for example, and then you could re-render all the books, even though you changed like one author on one of the books. And so it gives you the powerful fetching that we have from the query, also being able to change data. So any questions about a mutation? Okay. So we'll see, we can run this and see how it works. So we get an ID, or we get an author back. So on the author, we get ID, title, or no, first name, last name, and then you can get the books, or book Z now, back from here. And we haven't created any books yet, so it's going to return null, but you see you get all that power of GraphQL querying with mutations. And another thing is the thing I love most about GraphQL mutations is, so at work, my coworker will write a mutation, I'm on the client side, And we used to before, it's like REST API, he wrote the thing, and he'd say he didn't do the best job document. I'm like, yo dude, what does this take? He's like, I don't know, just go look at the code. So sometimes when you go look at the code of the REST API, you're like, okay, I have no idea what variables this is taking, what he's gonna return to me, like I'm on my own. Does anybody else like had that similar experience? Yes. So with GraphQL, like he's lazy. I'm lazy. I don't document my REST APIs, and he doesn't define anything. Well, by design, GraphQL says, okay, he's expecting a first name and a last name, and here's what he's returning. He's returning a author, and so then I can query as my heart desires from the author. And I think that was one of the things when we first started getting into using GraphQL. I was like, this is amazing. Like, no more like hunting my friend down or looking through his code, and it really changed. It really was a productivity boost for all of us, I think. So here's GraphQL, or a mutation. So on a mutation, you have like this little input type, and this is just the convention of graphing. So you define input, and I'm taking, let's go look at the author one. So I'm taking a first name and a last name, and I'm returning an author. Can everybody see this? Okay. So we can see that these two are the things that we defined, and it converts to snake case automatically. That's part of graphing. So if you see that mismatch, just know that's done for you automatically. And it has required is true. So another good thing about GraphQL is, who likes writing validation on their REST APIs? Anybody like writing validation? I don't think so. So that's another cool thing is, oh, I didn't pass last name. Well, it will automatically give me an error here. But it also says, okay, last name of type string is required but not provided. I did not write a single line of validation code for that. It automatically knew that from the query I passed in, which I think it's amazing because I hate writing validation code. It seems all unnecessary, and well, it's necessary, but it seems very tedious. So the first name and last name are passed in. So the mutations have this magic method, like we have resolve underscore for our queries. They have this mutate method. And so it's a similar concept. We have our 4 arguments. You'll see these on all your resolvers, these 4 arguments, and they're the same everywhere. Since we're at the root, self is going to be null. And then we have args, which here is first name and last name. So you just you save it right in your database with your model. So I create my model, and I just return it to my query. So it's kind of like a query and a mutation built into one. Questions?
So does your mutation handle both adding and editing?
No, you would have to define different types for that. So the one, I've read different stuff online, but basically it's like REST, except instead of using the verbs, it's like edit, author, add author. So you still have the tediousness of all of that, but it's still, you get strongly typed, and it's still not that much more code and all that. So, any other questions? So that is mutation. So here's the root mutation. This is where I register all my mutations that will be returned to my schema. So I have the author mutation field, the create book field, and the add reader to book field. Those are all 3 mutations. Okay, so one last thing to wrap up. How am I doing on time? 7:30. So I mentioned earlier that I have my types, and this is on my model already. Like, why should I type these again? So that is the coolest thing about Graphene, is it has, for SQL Alchemy and Django, it has what we call SQL Alchemy types. So here, because of a bug, you have to type your ID to resolve to an int or resolve to a string. That's just a bug in Graphene. I don't know when that's going to be fixed, but that's one only thing. But basically, it's like you pass in the model, the metadata, you have a meta class, and you pass in the model for the author, and then it just knows, it reflects all over your SQL Alchemy, and it just generates all your types for you and all your resolvers to your related objects. So I have the book and I have the reader. So instead of typing all those fields out, you just pass in your classes. And this is where I think that Python for GraphQL is way better than like Node or I don't know, what other language, because you can use GraphQL in any programming language. Graphene is just specific to Python. This is where I think that Python has overwhelmingly taken over. It's because in another language you have to find all your types and everything, and here it just generates it all for you. So we can go to the query here and comment these types out, and then import our SQL Alchemy types. And let's comment this and this out, and then uncomment this and this. So we keep these resolvers the same. I'm getting a lint there. And we keep our resolvers the same, but we don't have any of those nested root resolvers. We've only defined these 3 types. We haven't defined any relationships or anything in our types like we did in the other one. So we go back here, we'll reload, and we have our query. So we still have our authors, and now we have the author SQL type, and then it knows, oh, hey, this has a relationship to books, so it has the book SQL resolver automatically generated. Same with reader. So we can go run our query from earlier, authors, ID, first name, last name, books, ID, readers, ID, first name, last name. And then boom, it knew automatically without defining any relationships, and I think that's it's a big productivity boost. And you can see it still does just the one query, and it still uses our efficiency of our join. Any questions? Yeah.
Can you define custom scalar types, and so like is that difficult or?
No, I don't think so. Basically, you just go. I think it's built into the specification that GraphQL only has these scalar types, which you can see here. It actually looks like you can. So you can have a date time, a time, and a JSON. So yes, you can.
Okay, so like for example, if you wanted like a custom like UUID type or something that could parse a string.
Yes.
Type, you could subclass a string type.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I have not done that, but yes, I think you can do that. So here's a good if you want some more overview, here's a good way. So you saw our object types and our resolvers and our mutations. This is a good resource to use. And I'll put the other code that I have up on GitHub. So, any other questions? One more slide. So I'm going to kind of move into the client side. So are some of you guys here full stack React experience or Angular or anything? Anybody here? Yeah. So there is 2 major libraries in the front end space for interfacing with GraphQL. And there is Relay, which I would not use it. It is way too complicated and I don't like it at all. I mean, you can use it, but it's not my recommendation. I don't know. It just seems very bloated, and you have to define some like custom metadata in your server beyond what's like in the base GraphQL, and I just don't like it that much. I really like Apollo GraphQL. So, have any of you heard of Meteor, the Node framework? Yeah, this is the same people that made Meteor. They also have Apollo, which is a GraphQL framework. So you see some pretty big guys, Airbnb, Ticketmaster, New York Times, use this. So they have libraries. I'm not going to go through all of these because we'd be here all night. But they have libraries here you can use for your favorite framework. I'm a React guy, so it has, it shows you, oh hey, I want to define my query, and it provides, oh, I've got my query, and then I can wrap my component, and it will put all my data right in my props for me. So it's really nice to work with on the front end as well. So you don't have to like define like all your HTTP calls and everything. It was just like, oh, I have my query. When my component renders, I'll have these props. Good to go. So that's a big productivity boost on the client as well. So, so it might seem like this is another big misconception. This is the last thing I'm going to go over. Is so some people will say, oh, you should always use one of those front-end libraries, but you can actually do GraphQL requests in raw HTTP. So requests, most people, have you guys used here requests? Yeah. So I define my GraphQL query just like I did in graphical here, and then I do requests.post, and then I go to my endpoint there that I defined in my Flask app, and it takes JSON. And so the variable it takes is query, and then the argument there. So this is what you pass in to your window over here, is what you pass into your query right here. So you hit that endpoint with your query, and then it returns your status code, which your status code with GraphQL will always be 200. Even if you get an error, it will have like errors key in there, but it'll still be at 200. So that's one thing you have to look out for, is you need to kind of parse your result to get your error code. You don't get it for the HTTP status code. And so it returns JSON. So just as we saw, here I can run it to prove it's working. So you just do Python client.py, and it returns, you saw DerbyPy that we created, and then as ID, first name, last name. So if you scroll up to here, it has your data, authors, just like we saw earlier. Any other questions?
Question on the query syntax. So there's no commas between the arguments.
No.
Do they need to be on separate lines, or?
Yes.
Okay.
So it is space significant, and you can use commas, like that's not an error. So you could save that and use it, but most people I've seen do not use commas. Any other questions? Actually, I lied. I have one more slide. Sorry. I don't have a slide, but I want to talk about the future of GraphQL. So GraphQL right now is really good at HTTP, like I want this query and I want to mutate some data, but real time. So any of you done like WebSockets or anything like that and want some real time data? GraphQL subscriptions is something it's just got into the spec, and that should be something you look out for. So basically, it's a query that you send up to the server, and every time the data changes on the server, it will replay the query you sent it, and it will return you the new data. So if that's something that GraphQL is something you want to look into, you can look out for that. And I believe that the support for that just got dropped in the GraphQL core today. So GraphQL Python. The GraphQL core today, they just merged in the support for subscriptions. Yep. So that was just merged in. There you go. So that's something to look out for the future. But any other questions? One thing that I did not cover that you can feel free to chat up with me afterwards, and I probably should have covered this, but it's a long and boring topic, is authorization and authentication. Like, who has permission to view this data? And that is one thing that is also very hard to find online, and a lot of people have opinions about that. So if you want to know like how I deal with it, you can just shoot me an email, or you can pick my brain afterwards, and I can go over that with you.